women make up 2 out of 3 cases for Alzheimer's disease. And so I'm very excited about hormone replacement therapy. When HRT is administered close to the onset of menopause, like within 5 years, there was a 32% risk reduction for the diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease. Martha Claire Morris, she published a study a couple years ago that found that people who eat a bowl of dark leafy greens every day have brains that perform up to 11 years younger.
Speaking of foods, which foods in the research have been shown to have the most cognitive protection versus those that are the most damaging or risky to be consuming on a daily basis?
Let's start with risky. So
Max Lugavere
is a health and science journalist, filmmaker, and best-selling author.
Known for his work on brain health, nutrition, and preventive medicine.
He gained recognition with his documentary, Breadhead,
which explores the impact of diet and lifestyle on cognitive decline.
He is the author of several books, including Genius Foods and The Genius Life.
And the host of the Genius Life podcast, where he interviews leading experts in health, science, and personal development.
The overconsumption of ultra-processed foods was linked to 32 negative health outcomes. But now Alzheimer's disease is actually being linked to the overconsumption of ultra-processed foods. Every 10% increase in ultra-processed foods a person consumes, their risk seems to increase by 25%.
Is there protein that you would say is more superior in terms of the research supporting brain health compared to others?
Now, this is a controversial statement. Not everybody agrees with me on this. But if you actually look at the data...
Welcome to the Dr. Brighten Show, where we burn the BS in women's health to the ground. I'm your host, Dr. Jolene Brighten, and if you've ever been dismissed, told your symptoms are normal or just in your head, or been told just to deal with it, this show is for you. And if while listening to this, you decide you like this kind of content, I invite you to head over to drbrighten.com, where you'll find free guides, twice weekly podcast releases, and a ton of resources to support you on your journey. Let's dive in. When it comes to Alzheimer's, why do you think mainstream medicine still tells so many people there's nothing you can do until it's too late?
Well, because Alzheimer's disease, which is the most common form of dementia, is a condition that begins in the brain years, if not decades, prior to the first symptom. So the degree of pathology that's already present in the brain by the time you've arrived at a diagnosis is striking. And I think that's part of the reason why Alzheimer's drug trials have such a notoriously dismal success rate. 99.6% of Alzheimer's drug trials fail. That's worse for any other condition. And that's just because by the time you've arrived at that diagnosis, you've got amyloid plaque buildup in the brain, the degree of hypometabolism, meaning the brain's ability to generate energy from its primary energy substrate, glucose, is already diminished by at least 50%. There's typically marked shrinkage in the brain due to widespread neuronal death. So it's a condition that we really need to be talking about through the lens of prevention. And that's what my entire body of work pretty much has been about, to try to shift the focus. Not that treatment isn't important. I mean, I come at this as the loved one of somebody who had dementia for many years. And so it's a deeply personal topic for me. But once I saw the relative dearth of treatment options and have become essentially fluent, or as fluent as one can be without being an academic researcher or a neurologist in the research on, these pharmacologic interventions, to me it became very clear that if this was a condition that we were going to halt the growing prevalence of, we were going to need to essentially prevent it. And we don't have all of the answers. It's a rapidly evolving field of science. In fact, when I wrote my first book, Genius Foods, which came out in 2018, 90% of what we had known about Alzheimer's disease, we basically just learned over the prior 15 years. So it's a condition where, we're learning new things every day, but despite all the remaining questions, we do, at this point, I would say, have a roadmap in terms of how we might live to, reduce our risk, if not prevent it altogether.
Well, we're going to get into all the prevention. I want people to know that today. But before we get into that, I want to ask you, you said, okay, this starts developing decades in advance before the first symptoms show up. But I think a lot of people think neurodegenerative disease is all at once, we're losing memories, it's so noticeable. But what are the subtle signs leading up to it?
Well, I'm not sure that there are signs that are immediately observable. in the absence of imaging. I mean, really, it's imaging that can show you, there are scans like the FTG PET, which basically shows how well the brain is utilizing glucose, which again is, under fed conditions, its primary energy substrate. But there are certain genetic markers that you can look at, and there are correlates in terms of blood biomarkers. And we're actually also, I think, on the cusp of, elucidating blood biomarkers that correlate even more strongly than the blood markers that we already have.
Mm-hmm.
But what I would say is, if you are somebody who is trending towards metabolic dysfunction, which is widespread in society today, about 90% of adults have at least one component of metabolic syndrome, then that's a pretty clear indicator that you are raising your risk for that condition. And it's a condition that, by and large, the heritability is quite low. So many people, one of the biggest misconceptions is that this is a genetic condition. And certainly there are genetic variants like early onset familial Alzheimer's disease, which accounts for 2 to 3% of cases. But that's a very rare genetic mutation that, by and large, most people do not have. Most people who develop Alzheimer's disease will develop a sporadic, late onset form. And there are indeed genetic risk factors for it, but they're not deterministic genes. And so anybody, whether they're genetic carriers, whether they had Alzheimer's disease in the family or not, can one day be diagnosed with the condition. And, we have a slew of now what are known as modifiable risk factors that may increase or decrease in their absence your risk for being diagnosed with that condition.
I want to ask about modifiable risk factors, but in terms of early screening, do you think we should be advocating for imaging, for doing more testing to screen people for neurodegenerative disease rather than waiting until there's those first symptoms?
Yeah, I do think so. I think that this is something that should be part of every annual physical, looking at blood biomarkers through the lens of brain health. I think one day we're going to, the same way that you go to your, get your annual physical and they draw lipids, they check out your blood glucose, your, fasting insulin, all that stuff, your hormones. I think one day they'll look to see blood levels of, for example, AB42 and its ratio to AB40, which is thought now to be a window into amyloid aggregation in the brain. We're not there yet, but I think within the next 5 to 10 years, we will be. And it's something that, should definitely be checked, on physicals once we can sort of standardize that test and determine reference ranges and stuff. We're still, quite a bit a ways away. But all that is to say, we still have these modifiable risk factors, which, according to the last Lancet Commission on Dementia Prevention, there are 14 of them. And I think right there, already that's a pretty actionable roadmap in terms of how one might, cater to their biology to reduce risk.
You have a family member who struggled with dementia. It's what inspired your work. I'm curious, what are you screening and paying attention to ensure you have the healthiest brain?
Well, my mother had a form of dementia called Lewy body dementia, which it has more actually in common with Parkinson's disease than it has with Alzheimer's disease. But it took us, anybody with a sick loved one will know that sometimes it takes years to arrive at a diagnosis, especially when the presentation is atypical. And so for many years, my focus was actually Alzheimer's disease. But, because of what my mom was ultimately diagnosed with and my just overarching interest and passion for, just general brain health. For me, there's a few things that I'm, hoping to achieve with every physical. So for one, I'm looking to make sure that I'm in pristine metabolic health. So I want to make sure that my body composition is good, that I'm well muscled. That's going to, what that's going to do is encourage optimal insulin sensitivity. So that's going to ensure that my fasting blood sugar is nice and healthy. My fasting insulin is nice and healthy. I'm looking to make sure that my fasting triglycerides are low. I look at markers like my homocysteine, which when elevated can increase risk for cardiovascular disease and Alzheimer's disease. There are certain micronutrients like vitamin D. We want to make sure that our vitamin D levels are optimal. We want to look at our omega-3 index and make sure that that's sound. Yeah, so I mean, that's from the sort of Alzheimer's side. You want to make sure that all those surrogate sort of metabolic health markers are important because, as I mentioned earlier, one of the earliest features in the disease, even prior to the presentation of clinical symptoms, is hypometabolism. And what the research shows is that our insulin sensitivity actually is correlated to an improvement in the way that the brain uses energy. And conversely, insulin resistance is correlated to the degree of hypometabolism in the brain. So I want to make sure that I'm insulin sensitive. I want to make sure that I've got a healthy body composition. All that stuff is crucially important. And then on the Parkinson's disease side, now this is something that we didn't even have this data, or at least I wasn't familiar with it when I wrote my first book, Genius Foods. But I think it is a rapidly growing field of research. And part of that has to do with the fact that Parkinson's disease is now the world's fastest growing brain disease. And there's this whole environmental connection to Parkinson's disease, which I think is really important. And there's a neurologist out of the University of Rochester named Dr. Ray Dorsey, who's become a bit of a mentor to me in terms of his research. And so, we're now starting to see, on top of the blood biomarkers, the role of, for example, air pollution in neurodegenerative diseases, both Alzheimer's disease actually and Parkinson's disease. I'm trying to make sure that, for the most part, I'm drinking water that's clean, because water, depending on where you're getting your water from, can be, throughout the United States, there are municipalities where the water has some degree of contamination of, for example, trichloroethylene, which is a compound that's been strongly linked to Parkinsonism. I try to buy, organic food when I can. It's not more nutritious, but it does reduce, and it's not perfect, but it does reduce your exposure to synthetic pesticides. It doesn't altogether eliminate it. Again, it's not perfect, but I think, when you're eating something regularly and you're eating the skin or the peel or the full leaf, I think it's important to, prioritize organic from the standpoint of, this burgeoning research with regards to Parkinson's disease.
And I think when we look at also the farm workers who are being exposed to these pesticides as well, opting for lower pesticide residue on your food is also contributing to less exposure for the employee as well. So it's one of those factors that goes beyond us. And whenever people are like, well, it's not more nutritional, I'm like, well, then you've missed the point of why we're doing this.
Yeah. And when you were on my podcast, you were so eloquent and hilarious when you were, kind of pushing back to that rhetoric that you see a lot on social media. Like, nobody's saying it's more nutritious. Nobody's saying a little bit of conventional produce here and there is going to kill you. Nobody's saying don't eat conventional produce if you can't afford or can't access organic. Nobody's saying that. But on the other hand, there is data showing that certain widely used herbicides like paraquat have been associated with, mitochondrial damage that is then linked to Parkinsonism, and that a lot of these companies, these producers actually, will attempt to suppress, this data. There was an article that I can cite in the Telegraph written by Carrie Gillum, who is an investigative journalist who really published this mind-blowing and ultimately really dystopic expose on how Syngenta, which produces paraquat, buried the neurologic harms of this herbicide for decades. And so I just think, like, where your health is concerned, and now, with the current administration, like, they're trying to reduce the liability, if not eliminate it in certain states, of these pesticide producers. So, it's just a Pandora's box of, like, where are you going to go, on that dark day when you are ultimately diagnosed. So for me, it's just, a form of added insurance to just buy organic if it's something that you're eating regularly.
In the context of now our understanding of Parkinson's disease linked with environmental toxins, if you could change one national guideline, policy, EPA protection that could really impact people's brain's health, like, what would that be for you?
Well, with regards to the pesticides, I think we need independent studies. We need studies that are not funded by industry. I think, that would be a great first step. The conflicts of interest have to go. And that's one of the things that actually excited me about the promise of RFK Jr. becoming the Secretary of Health and Human Services, at least during election time, because of his background as an environmental lawyer. I mean, he's spent his whole career pushing back against pesticide manufacturers. So as somebody for whom this topic is really important, I mean, that was something that, I was more than happy to get behind. Now, I don't want to get political at all, but
we're talking health. It's impossible.
Yeah, it's kind of impossible. He's sort of in this, in this environment within the broader current administration that represents a political party that, at least historically, has been lax with regards to these kinds of regulations. So, I don't know how it's going to play out. I remain optimistic, but again, my passion is brain health, and I'm going to fight for that, regardless of political affiliation.
Yeah, and as you said, the current administration just tried to start walking back on holding these pesticide companies accountable. And I think that is a thing that a lot of people are having a hard time reconciling with, is that there's this, we want to be healthy, we want to help fertility, we want to prevent chronic disease, but we also want to allow PFAS in the water, and we're going to let pesticide companies do what they want to do. And I feel like in a lot of ways, I'm like, we need the right scientists as part of these conversations, because I feel like there's HHS and they're having their conversations. And then there's like, when the lobbyists get in the room with this guy over here, and it's like, we need to make sure that we've got a holistic conversation going on, not just what the lobbyist, wants to present to a bunch of politicians who are not scientists, and they're not supposed to be scientists. That's not what their career trajectory has been.
Yeah. And, I strongly believe that making America healthy is ultimately a bottom-up, a ground-up endeavor. I think the first domino is education, educating the public, because politicians respond to their contingencies. They respond to the people. So, I think, let politicians politic. They're always going to do that, right? I think my role, your role, obviously, ultimately, all of us who are passionate about public health, for me, the focus is on educating people, because the people are what control government ultimately. And so I think if there are these walkbacks, well, maybe it's just that there aren't enough people, clamoring about the health risks. More people need to know about this stuff.
Yeah. Well, I want to, in that same vein, talk about the other modifiable risk factors, because we've talked about, there's environmental pollution. So we've got air pollution. We haven't really given a solution around that, but it's like reducing environmental toxins as much as possible. There is the metabolic health component. So we were talking about body composition, but also the lab testing, making sure that that's dialed in. But you mentioned 14 modifiable risk factors. I mean, that's a lot of power. I think some people will hear that and be like, whoa, that's really
overwhelming.
Yeah. But I think about Dr. Dale Bredesen and how he says, it's like a sieve, and you don't have to plug every one of those holes. But if you plug enough of them, you're gonna make a significant amount of progress towards health. And so with that in mind, I want people not to get overwhelmed, but to see this as an opportunity of there's a lot that you can do to improve your brain health.
Yeah. Well, so there are 3 non-modifiable risk factors: your age, your gender, and your genetics.
And what age are we concerned about?
Well, advanced age increases your risk. And that may be typical. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's normal, but, things tend to falter as we get older. We tend to, become more sedentary with advanced age. So age remains the number 1 modifiable risk factor. And also, I think it's worth pointing out that women make up 2 out of 3 cases for Alzheimer's disease. And so I'm very excited to now be learning more about hormone replacement therapy and its ability to potentially stave off this condition. There was just recently a meta-analysis that came out. It was a meta-analysis of both observational and randomized controlled trials that found that when HRT is administered close to the onset of menopause, within 5 years, there was a 32% risk reduction for the diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease, which is just incredible.
Yeah.
And I'm not an expert in menopause medicine or anything like that, but
yeah, I think, and also for people listening, you juxtapose that to the studies on hysterectomies that are happening far in advance of the age in menopause. So maybe you're in your 30s without giving HRT, you have about a 30% decline, cognitively speaking, compared to your cohort when you do reach menopause, those women who have had hormones the entire time. So I think, this is something we can no longer ignore.
It's, yeah, absolutely not. And my mother was terrified of HRT because of the Women's Health Initiative, which, really cast a pall of negative PR on what is otherwise, I think, potentially a life-changing treatment for women. And it's really upsetting. But I'm happy that now we have experts such as yourself and others, really sounding the alarm on how valuable this can be for certain women. So as I mentioned, women, are unfortunately at higher risk. And then your genes are non-modifiable. We can influence how they express themselves, of course. That's, attributed to epigenetics, which is very exciting. But those are, by and large, the sort of uncontrollables. But we have 14 modifiable risk factors. So, everything from obesity, making sure that you're not obese, which unfortunately by the year 2030, that's going to be 1 in 2 people. It's
wild.
A staggering statistic. Yeah. Making sure that you're not a type 2 diabetic. If you have type 2 diabetes, your risk increases between 2 and 4-fold. So again, insulin resistance, which is the, cornerstone of type 2 diabetes, it seems to impair your brain's ability to generate energy, which is crucially important. Your brain is a massive energy consumer. Hypertension. So hypertension is a big one. You want to make sure that you don't have high blood pressure. You don't want to make sure that you're a pre-hypertensive. Crucially important. We know that exercise is amazing in terms of helping to stave off hypertension. We know that certain nutrients like potassium is crucially important. I'm not a big sodium, I'm not convinced that sodium is really the demon outside of the context of our overconsumption of ultra-processed foods, which are by and large why most people tend to overconsume sodium. It's because most people tend to overconsume ultra-processed foods. But there are studies coming out showing that, when our potassium intake is high and even our magnesium intake, when that's all, good, then the risk for hypertension seems to be quite low. And those minerals work, in concert with one another to make sure that you're normotensive. What happens with high blood pressure is that it basically damages, you get these microstrokes in the brain, which can lead to stroke, obviously, but it can also lead to a more subtle type of cognitive decline. And early vascular dysfunction occurs in Alzheimer's disease. So want to make sure that you're not hypertensive. And then we have other modifiable risk factors like depression, early education early in life seems to reduce risk. Lack of education seems to increase risk. Hearing loss is a new one. We want to make sure that, we're protecting our ears because hearing loss isolates us from the world and we require social interaction in order to, keep our brains stimulated and healthy. Vision loss, I believe, is a relatively new one. We just want to make sure that as we age, our senses are functioning, so that we can continue to engage. And then air pollution. Air pollution is a big one, which we touched on. Newly added to the 2024 Lancet Commission on Dementia Prevention was high LDL cholesterol. I have mixed feelings about that. I think obviously if LDL is very high, it's something that you should bring down, but I don't believe that we ought to be chasing newborn levels of LDL, which is, sometimes if you look at certain nutrition pockets on the internet, seems to be what they're suggesting. High LDL is also, I think, a surrogate marker for the consumption of the standard American diet, which is going to raise pretty much all lipids in the body. But all that is to say that is a newly identified modifiable risk factor. Blood sugar, we want to make sure that that's, at a healthy level. So, yeah, that's just broad strokes kind of overview, but all those things are we talk about that stuff all the time. And by eating the kinds of, foods and dietary patterns that you recommend, that I recommend, I mean, it's not like all of this stuff has to be constantly in your consciousness at all times. It's like if you're, you know, majoring in the majors and exercising regularly and eating a largely whole foods diet, a lot of that stuff is going to take care of itself.
Mm-hmm. Well, speaking of foods, which foods in the research have been shown to have the most cognitive protection versus those that are the most damaging or risky to be consuming on a daily basis?
Well, let's start with risky. So ultra-processed foods, there's just no getting around the fact that when we overconsume those foods, they increase our risk for a whole host of negative health outcomes. In fact, there was an updated review and meta-analysis published just last year that found that the overconsumption of ultra-processed foods was linked to 32 negative health outcomes. Pretty much every bad health outcome you can imagine is linked to the overconsumption of ultra-processed foods. Mm-hmm. The obvious stuff, cardiovascular disease, hypertension, type 2 diabetes, obesity, but now Alzheimer's disease is actually being linked to the overconsumption of ultra-processed foods. Every 10% increase in ultra-processed foods a person consumes, their risk seems to increase by 25%. We didn't even have that data when I wrote my first book, even though in my first book, we were prescient, we sounded the alarm on the dangers of ultra-processed foods, just from the standpoint of their calorie density, of their hyperpalatability. But now we're seeing that, lo and behold, they do seem to increase risk for these brain conditions. And then also mental health. Ultra-processed foods are associated with depression, anxiety. The direction of causality is, I think, probably it goes both ways. When you're depressed, you tend to reach for more ultra-processed foods. But insofar as these foods are, very difficult to moderate, in terms of our consumption of them, they're highly calorie dense. They tend to be nutrient poor. They tend to also be Trojan horses for, chemicals that you won't necessarily find on the nutrition facts label, but, everything from PFAS to phthalates to, bisphenols, endocrine disrupting chemicals. Mm-hmm. One of the major routes of ingestion for them are ultra-processed foods today. So I would say you generally want to avoid those. And
can you define what ultra-processed foods are in the context of this conversation? Because I don't know why anybody on the internet feels like they need to defend ultra-processed foods, but they sure do. And then they're like, well, if you eat whey protein, you're eating ultra-processed food. And I'm like, just hang on. That's not quite accurate. So for people listening, what exactly are ultra-processed foods?
Yeah, so that idea that whey protein is an ultra-processed food, first of all, it's not. It's a processed food, mm-hmm. of course, but it's not an ultra-processed food. The term ultra-processed food was coined by the NOVA food scoring system, which was devised in Latin America. And in broad strokes, the way that I would describe an ultra-processed food is something that you couldn't possibly make in your own kitchen if you tried. Mm-hmm. A good surrogate, and here's another bone to pick that I have with these online apologists for the food industry is the longer the ingredients list, the more likely that food is to be ultra-processed. Mm-hmm. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be bad for you. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be an ultra-processed food, but it's a pretty good sort of surrogate screening tool that you might use to, weed out foods that have gone through innumerable processing steps in order to arrive, in your shopping cart. Foods with, ingredients that you can't pronounce. Look, most people can't pronounce quinoa, right? So does that mean that every food that you can't pronounce is going to be bad for you? Absolutely not. But again, a food that you couldn't create in your own kitchen, generally it's a good screening tool. Mm-hmm. It's a good heuristic. Of course, you have to know a little bit about nutrition. It's sort of like I liken it to the BMI. The BMI is a good screening tool, right? Generally it's going to be accurate, but there are outliers. It's not a good diagnostic tool, mm-hmm. but it's, when you zoom out and look at the population level, look, not everybody's The Rock, not everybody's Joe Rogan, right? Who have BMIs that might, put them in the category of obese, but clearly they're not obese, right?
Yeah.
Same thing with the ultra-processed food designation. Long ingredients list, ingredients that you can't pronounce doesn't necessarily make it an ultra-processed food, but you could almost the odds are good. And then all that being said, even within the bucket of ultra-processed food, so say you've got an ultra-processed food in front of you, it might not necessarily be unhealthy because our understanding of these foods is very low resolution. We're starting to understand that some are better than others. So sugar-sweetened beverages are among the worst. But if you have an ultra-processed food that's been enriched with protein, maybe it doesn't have a ton of added sugar in it, maybe it's made with primarily healthful fats, for example, like that could actually be quite good for you, you know? So I think as we go further down this line of research, we're going to get a better understanding of, you know, the types of foods that are, you know, better or worse from us. There was a study that came out recently, actually, that found that it was a really cool study because, you know, I think it's smart to be critical of greenwashing and protein washing. You know, almost every ultra processed food today has like added protein, and it's like high protein on the front of package labeling, because now, you know, a lot of people are talking about protein, and I think for good reason. Now, granted, a lot of ultra-processed foods will claim that they have high protein, that they are high protein, when in fact they're not. But so you gotta look at the nutrition facts label and learn how to understand nutrition needs to some degree. But what this study found was that high protein ultra-processed foods compared to low protein ultra-processed foods, people still tended to overconsume the high protein ultra-processed foods, but not to the same degree that they overconsumed the low protein ultra-processed foods. So adding protein to an ultra-processed food actually made it less likely to be overconsumed.
Interesting.
Yeah, and it actually makes sense because we know that protein is the most satiating macronutrient. So who knows? High protein ultra-processed foods might not be nearly as bad as, you know, sugar-sweetened beverages, for example.
Yeah. And I think this is the nuance that social media purposely tries to drive out of us when we're having these conversations. And you talked about the long list of ingredients and saying like, oh, well, if it's got a long list, odds are it's probably going to be ultra processed. You know, I've seen people hit back on that. And I've even seen people saying like, oh, they're trying to get people to like read nutrition labels and facts. Like that's just going to create this orthorexia. And I was studying nutrition 25 years ago, and it was driven into us that we need to get everybody competent to read not just nutrition facts tables, but actually read the ingredients. And these little things like the longer the list, like the likely the less nutrient dense this is, unless they're adding back nutrients, were things that were part of standard nutrition curriculum. But now somehow, 25 years later, it is like this fringe crazy thing that you would even like try to talk to people about this. And I'm like, there's this idea of like, it has to all be so perfect and scientifically accurate, and people losing the plot, which is that we more are trying to get people first to pay attention, raise awareness. And it is a step that you take with people to get them to a place where they're completely literate to read these labels. But it starts with things like long list, red flag. That gets people to pause, look, and start to read and get curious. It's not saying, long list, red flag, never eat it. And I think that's really important. I just want to underline what you say there, because I know someone listening to this probably already misunderstanding and deciding to run with like, no, you're fear mongering or something like that.
Definitely not. No, it's not fear mongering. In fact, I think the public is tired of being gaslit, and you know, there are very few nutrition experts on social media today who I would direct people to, because, you know, I don't think that you ought to need a PhD or to have, you know, achieved an advanced degree to know how to feed yourself and your loved ones and to know how to understand nutrition labels. You know, I think we have this, you know, culture of authority, of credentialism, and I think there's a time and place for credentials in the clinical setting, in the hospital setting, of course. I'm a fan of medicine. I'm the beneficiary of a surgery. You know, we were talking before we got rolling.
Went through surgery. Big fan of experts.
big fan of experts. But, you know, on the other hand, there is this culture of muddying the waters to make them seem deep. And I don't think, you know, I think we need to get back to trusting our intuition on certain things. You know, we've long been kind of, you know, we're kind of taught, I think, we're brought into society with this expectation that, oh, just let the experts, you know, worry about it. Like, you know, your doctor is there for healthcare, when in reality it's sick care, which of course, you know, we will all benefit from at certain points in our lives. And it's crucially important. But this idea that, that people should should somehow like not trust their instincts and should, outsource their understanding of nutrition to the so-called experts. I mean, yeah, there's a time and a place for that, but I've benefited tremendously from my own studies in nutrition, and whatever knowledge I've garnered has been circuitous to say the least. So
yeah. Well, you can't tell me, and someone's going to call me a conspiracy theorist, and I don't care, because you can't tell me they didn't remove home ec and nutrition education and then put vending machines and ultra-processed food onto kids' campuses. So from college all the way down to like preschool in some instances. And that wasn't all a design. Like, absolutely nobody should be unable to navigate our food system. And it's very interesting because as you talked about ultra processed food coming from Latin America, they also have giant sugar warnings on their boxes. If there is excess sugar or excess fat, there is a huge label that you cannot miss. Children's sugary cereals, they don't get to have characters on them at all. It's nothing but facts right up front. You want to grab this? Like, this has excess sugar. And it's so in a snapshot, like one instant, you can just make a decision. You have all these yogurts in front of you, right? Because we have so much variety in the grocery stores. And you look at it and immediately you can see the big letters and you're like, none of those, okay, this is my only option. They have tried to start changing things to make it so it's even easier for consumers to make those decisions. But even like their cigarettes, I actually just posted this video on social media how like Mexico doesn't mess around. The cigarette box says on the front of it, smoking kills. Not Marlboro, not whatever the name is. It just says smoking kills. That's what you're purchasing. And then when you get the box, there is like cancer, tumors, lungs, like on there. They're like, if you don't even know how to read, we want to make it so clear to you what you're consenting to. And I'm like, that's interesting. What would that look like in the American food system if we applied that?
Yeah. I mean, I think that we should put warning labels on sugar sweetened beverages at the very least. I mean, there's no necessity for added sugar. We don't need it in our diets. It's not to say that a little bit is going to kill you.
Yeah. And for people, we're not talking about fruit. We're not talking about eating blueberries.
Exactly. We're not talking about blueberries. We're not talking about fruit. Don't fear fruit, please. But the sugar sweetened beverages, I mean, those are a huge problem. I mean, every so often there are studies that come out linking them directly, like those foods, if you want to call them that, directly to cardiovascular deaths, all-cause mortality. They're just not good for you. There's no satiety value from sugar sweetened beverages. It's just purely empty calories. And yeah, so I mean, at the very least, we should have warning labels on those. I think that there is this tendency to think in terms of black and white, and it is important to state, like, you can have your indulgence now and then. Like, the problem is today, 60% of the calories that your average adult consumes comes from these kinds of foods, ultra-processed foods. And for children, it's even higher. It's about 70%. And for certain ethnic groups, it's even higher than that. So, this is something that we definitely need to be educating around. And I think what gives me optimism about our current timeline is that it is something that more and more people seem to be talking about. So I am, grateful there. At the end of the day, I think the more you can shop around the perimeter of the supermarket, which is where all the fresh, perishable foods tend to be, I think that's great. And then the fear-mongering that you still see in some pockets around, meat, eggs, dairy, I think all that, even fruit, I mean, even plant foods, like there are still influencers today fear-mongering the consumption of bananas and grapes and things like that.
Yeah.
And I just think it's hugely problematic. I mean, nobody out there, if you're following anybody who's fear-mongering a whole food, then you're following the wrong person, I think,
I had a man who's an influencer like jump down my throat because I had the audacity to post my breakfast, which was like Greek yogurt. I sprinkle oats on there, psyllium husk, ground flax seeds, usually chia seeds, and then fruit. And he's like, oats are such a source of glyphosate and like you should never eat those. I'm like, I need you as a man to understand that my microbiome is more diverse than yours. So I need more diversity. And as I age and lose estrogen, I lose diversity. And one of the best things I can do to combat it is diversity of fiber in my diet. So what I'm doing here isn't just consuming glyphosate. I like to call it microdosing my microbiome with like, let's get like different fibers in and show it different things. And I just was like, if you think that oats or kale or tomato or beans are the problem, you have lost the plot.
Exactly.
This is not the problem that people are eating whole foods. Like, the majority of people in the United States who are dealing with chronic disease, it's not because they choose to have a bowl of oatmeal. That is not the problem that's going on here. And I think when people end up getting kind of in their own little health bubbles, right? And they're like, they lose touch with people and they're like, well, like I've already cut out fast food, ultra processed food. Like I've already done all these things. And it's almost like they're always searching for like, what more can I cut out to optimize? And it's like, well, sometimes actually it's the opposite. So what more can I add in? Like, let's go to the Asian market or the, Hispanic section of the store and let's look at things our microbiome's never seen in our life and try to eat those.
Yeah. I mean, it is. That's why, I mean, for example, in my first book, it's not a book that fearmongers food products. It's a book that implores you to eat what I call the genius foods. And like, for somebody who's just like starting out on their health journey, I mean, the approach that I would take is not necessarily to cut out anything other than perhaps sugar sweetened beverages. Because, I mean, again, just a huge source for Americans of completely empty calories.
And completely unnecessary.
Yeah.
If you want pleasure, friends, have a piece of cake.
Exactly. Have a piece of cake. But yeah, I mean, I think like incrementally adding more protein to the diet is actually something that would benefit most people.
Mm-hmm.
I think with even an incremental increase in protein, most people would tend to find their hunger more well-regulated. They would consume likely fewer calories from carbohydrates and fats, which are essentially just energy, and very few people today are wanting for energy. In fact, today is the first time in human history that not only do we have more people walking the earth that are overweight than underweight, but more children, more adolescents that are more overweight than underweight. This is something that just recently, flipped. So we're not wanting for energy. Protein, on the other hand, in many ways regulates our hunger mechanisms. This is owed to what's referred to as the protein leverage hypothesis. So add a little bit more protein, see how that makes you feel, especially for breakfast. I mean, there's a lot of data now on how valuable a high protein breakfast is. I used to scoff at this. This is actually an area where I've kind of changed my mind. I used to think breakfast was just completely non-essential. But front loading your day with a high protein meal, 25, 35 grams of protein, it's a great way to calibrate your hunger mechanisms in a way that's going to pay dividends over the course of the day. Studies show that when people eat high protein breakfast, they eat fewer calories actually over the course of the day from carbohydrates and fats. And that's because, again, protein is the most satiating macronutrient, but also, after a night of sleep, you're in muscle protein breakdown. So by consuming a bolus of protein of 25 grams of protein relatively soon after you wake up, you're pumping the brakes on muscle protein breakdown, you're stimulating muscle protein synthesis. It's going to keep you satiated. You're not going to be as inclined to hit the rec room for, the granola bar or God forbid, the donut. And yeah, so it's addition often is my advice to people that are just starting out.
What are the other genius foods people should consider putting on their plate?
Yeah, so I mean, I'm a big fan of dark leafy greens. I've gone to bat for them many times, as often as I sometimes get labeled as a carnivore advocate, which I'm absolutely not. I'm not a carnivore dieter.
I thought you were going to say kale advocate. Kale for a moment was getting hate on by everyone.
Oh, I love kale.
I know, and I was like, yeah, I'm going to keep eating my kale.
Yeah, no, kale's great. It's actually the top dietary source of lutein and zeaxanthin, which are, it's a mouthful, but they're, no pun intended, of, in terms of the chemical names, but they're carotenoids, they're plant pigments that directly benefit eye health and brain health. And you're getting, I believe it's like 25 milligrams of combined lutein and zeaxanthin in just like a bowl of kale. Mm-hmm. It's also a low oxalate food. I can't tell you how many nutrition experts I've heard online demonize kale because they say it's oxalate rich when it's not. I mean,
yeah, I got questions for your kidneys if you're worried about that.
Yeah. I mean, like spinach, like avoid raw spinach if you're prone to kidney stones, right? But no, I think kale is fantastic. So yeah, dark leafy greens. Actually, one of the studies that I stumbled on really early on came out of Rush University. And it was actually, the first author was Martha Claire Morris, who's done a lot of work in my space, the dementia prevention, nutrition, brain health space. She's the originator of the MIND diet. And she published a study a couple years ago that found that people who eat a bowl of dark leafy greens every day have brains that perform up to 11 years younger.
Wow.
Yeah. So dark leafy greens have a lot going for them. I mean, the carotenoids, the dietary fiber, they're also a fantastic source of inorganic nitrate, which is really good for cardiovascular health and, supporting your nitric oxide pathway. We talked earlier about hypertension and how damaging that could be to the brain. Well, dark leafy greens are a great way to support healthy blood pressure. Provided you're chewing them slowly, because that conversion to nitrite occurs in the mouth. And so, yeah, dark leafy greens are great. I'm just looking at the cover of my book, but avocados, have a lot going for them. Super healthy fats, fantastic source of potassium, twice the potassium of a banana, actually. Again, great for your blood pressure. Good source of lutein and zeaxanthin. Fiber for your gut microbiome. So I love avocados. There's actually, there was a study that found that avocado consumers across every cognitive domain measured seem to perform better than non-avocado consumers. And guacamole counted in this study.
Yeah.
So, when they remind you that it's extra at Chipotle for the guac, it's worth it.
Yeah. It's funny because I have this thing I always say to my husband, if he makes a salad or has food a lot of times, then I'm like, missed avocado opportunity. Like if there's not avocado on my sandwich or avocado in the salad or avocado, I'm like, missed avocado opportunity. Like we want to make the most of this opportunity as often as possible. I'm curious about fruits because you're right. Fruits get villainized a lot. There's going to be people who are listening to this who are probably going to say like, well, I'm pre-diabetic. I have insulin resistance. My doctor told me stop eating fruits. We know there's fruits that are beneficial if you have blood sugar dysregulation. There's ways that you can pair them with other foods, but we also know there's certain fruits that really go the distance for brain health.
Yeah. Yeah. And it is, I mean, fruit, there are tropical fruits that tend to be higher in sugar, and there are low sugar fruits like berries. I probably would say that the lower sugar fruits are, likely better to consume more regularly. But, honestly, I don't want to fearmonger anybody away from any fruit because they all contain minerals. And at the end of the day, fruit, one of the beautiful things about any fruit, whole fruit, I'm not talking about fruit juice, but whole fruit is self-limiting because of the whole food matrix of fiber, of, water. Fruit tends to be very hydrating. But all that being said, yeah, there are some fruits that have emerged in the literature as being, particularly brain protective, and berries really kind of tick that box. In fact, the MIND diet, which I mentioned earlier, the only fruit that's recommended are berries, blueberries and strawberries. But, I would actually say that avocado, which is a fruit, is probably right up there with berries. I think avocado, I mean, from my estimation, avocados are very brain healthy. And then olives. So olives are also a fruit, and extra virgin olive oil is essentially a fruit juice. And there's a lot of data on extra virgin olive oil and how it might protect the brain. There's observational data. I think it's just, in fact, I know there was an observational study that came out recently. Just 8 grams a day of extra virgin olive oil, which I believe is a teaspoon, led to a 30% risk reduction of Alzheimer's disease. Correlation isn't causation, but this study found that, there was this risk reduction for people who regularly consume extra virgin olive oil. But then the broader body of literature, supports that observation. There are meta-analyses of randomized control trials that show that extra virgin olive oil is broadly anti-inflammatory. It helps to reduce amyloid aggregation in the brain. We know this from in vitro studies, which may also hold true in vivo. So yeah, there's a lot of good data on olive oil, which is olives are a fruit. So yeah, avocados, berries, and olives, I would say, are probably, if I had to pick like my top three brain protective fruits. Yeah.
Going back to the protein, is there protein that you would say is more superior in terms of the research supporting brain health compared to others?
Yeah, it's not controversial that fatty fish, is supportive of brain health. I mean, the omega-3s that it contains, salmon, herring, sardines, mackerel, all great from the standpoint of brain health. And, for quality sticklers in your audience, like I think, the observational research really it addresses commercial fish, like the consumption of fish that's widely available. So I don't think you have to be a quality stickler. I think just some fish is better than none. And there is a growing body of literature pointing to how red meat might actually be beneficial. Now, this is a controversial statement. Not everybody agrees with me on this. But if you actually look at the data, red meat has a lot going for it. I mean, it's one of the top sources of creatine, which, we know is beneficial to the brain, especially at high doses. Beef, contains a fraction of what you might get in a supplementary, creatine dose, but it's also a great source of protein. It's a great source of vitamin E. There was a meta-analysis recently of studies looking at beef consumption and its impact on cardiometabolic health. And the only it had no negative effect on blood pressure. It had no negative effect on triglycerides. The only conceivable negative effect that it had was a small bump in LDL cholesterol. But I think there's a lot more good going for beef than to be myopically fixated on that small bump in LDL cholesterol. And then there are observational studies showing that animal preprotein is linked to, for example, slowing of the atrophy rate of the hippocampus. It's for premenstrual women, it's a great source of iron, vitamin B12, zinc. So yeah, I'm happy to go to bat for red meat. I think it's a health food. Do you have to be a carnivore to get the benefits of red meat? Absolutely not. But I think, I do think it is beneficial.
Yeah, and you and I have been around long enough to watch eggs just, whiplash back and forth. Eggs are the devil. They're killing everybody. No, eggs are back in. Everybody eat eggs. Nope, we're not eating eggs again. And it's like, eggs are the new smoking. Oh, nope, actually, eggs are super healthy for you. And I'm like, look, the bet is that if it's whole foods, and you're structuring your plate correctly, you're getting the variety, you're having, protein, but you're also having lots of leafy greens, you're having all of the produce as well. Like, you don't really have to get stuck on, is the egg going to kill me or not? Or is the beef bad? Like, if we look at the studies where it's like beef is causing all these problems, red meat is a problem, they're often looking at populations who have very low fiber diets. Well, I would argue you could just have a low fiber diet. Period. Full stop. You're going to have health issues. You're going to have problems develop from that. They're looking at people who are eating primarily meat, and maybe, it's that whole steak and potatoes, right? The French are going to come for me. They're like, don't get our steak and frites twisted, lady. It's fine. But, when you're eating that in conjunction with ultra processed foods, but I also think it's kind of a distraction from the ultra processed food conversation to be, again, and this is where it's not just influencers, right? Literally anybody can be falling into this trap of saying this whole food is bad while ignoring all this ultra processed food, the added sugars, which we know are absolutely problematic.
Yeah, totally. I think the fear mongering of any whole food is borderline criminal. I mean, and that goes for red meat as well. I think it's one of the most nutrient-dense foods that we have available to us. And I really do. I mean, the early epidemiologic literature pointed to red meat as a boogeyman. It's easy to find links between red meat consumption and poor health outcomes. And this is attributed to something often referred to as healthy user bias. And what that basically implies is that people who tend to eat more red meat also tend to do things in their diets, with their diets and their lifestyles that might be contributing to those negative health outcomes. So there was a study looking at, it was, I think, from the NHS that looked at red meat consumption and found that people who consumed red meat were more likely to smoke. They were more likely to drink alcohol. They were more likely to have a high BMI, so higher risk for obesity. They were more likely to be of a lower socioeconomic status. And so, researchers do try to account for all that stuff, but there's no way to account for all the different variables that, that somebody who smokes, right? Like,
you're not going to out diet either. If you are smoking 15, cigarettes a day and you're binge drinking most nights, your diet, you're not going to out diet that lifestyle impact.
Exactly. And then when we do see the risk that is affected, that red meat imparts the increase in risk in those populations, I mean, they're typically very small. Like we see, 30% is generally the average that I've seen of an increase in relative risk for example, type 2 diabetes or whatever. But again, like to assume that red meat is playing a causal role there with a 30% increase in relative risk, that would stretch credulity to put it lightly. And so, but now that we're proceeding and we're getting, randomized control trials and meta-analyses, meta-analytic data, from those trials, like, to me, it's just, we never should have demonized, it's almost as if nutrition researchers took the lens of red meat being guilty until proven innocent, as opposed to, our approach should always be innocent until proven guilty when looking at a whole food, especially a food that's been in the human food supply.
Pesticides, no. Whole foods, yes.
Yeah, exactly.
That's where I'm like, we've got it backwards here.
Exactly. Like the precautionary principle shouldn't apply to whole foods, whole minimally processed foods. And so, now we're getting, lots of new data, different kinds of observational studies looking at different cohorts, getting better at controlling for all these different variables, and then also randomized control trials. But at the end of the day, I think red meat is a health food. I've gone on record many times saying that. Now, do you have to eat it? No, but I just think it's valuable.
When it comes to Parkinson's disease, what's coming down the pipeline in terms of like research developments that you're most excited about?
With Parkinson's disease, I think that if we can get better data on the environmental connections and then have that find its way into regulation, that would be amazing. Maybe it's a pipe dream, but I think that's exciting. Understanding the role of gut health in Parkinsonism, I think, is important to understand better, because as we discussed earlier, there is this sort of very clear occupational risk with being occupationally exposed to certain herbicides and pesticides. What we really don't know at this point is if chronic low levels of exposure through dietary exposure to synthetic herbicides and pesticides has any impact on our risk for Parkinsonism. It may. I mean, there is data suggesting that some of the proteinopathy that occurs in the brain in Parkinsonism might begin in the gut and then find a way to travel up the vagus nerve to the brain. And so I think that's, we need more data on that for sure. I think what we're being exposed to in terms of air pollution, I mean, that's, something that is a little bit more actionable. I think, making sure that we're breathing in clean air in our homes is crucially important. The nose is actually the front door to the brain. And what we inhale through our nose can actually access the brain, bypasses the blood-brain barrier. And the loss of sense of smell is one of the earliest preclinical symptoms in cognitive decline and Parkinsonism. And so it's interesting to consider that, what we inhale through our noses might actually poison the brain in some regard, which I know sounds scary, but it's also empowering. And I had a loved one with Parkinsonism, and so it's something that's become really a concern for me. So I try to be more cognizant of the air that I'm breathing, and I also try to calibrate a diet that's rich in antioxidants and compounds that can help my body better detoxify itself. I mean, the detox is sort of like a buzzword in the wellness industry that is often used to sell bogus laxative teas and whatnot. But I mean, there is a role for our diet in terms of helping to facilitate our detox pathways. Consuming cruciferous vegetables, consuming, sulfur-containing amino acids from eggs, from beef, again, even bone broth, collagenous tissue. We tend to underconsume an amino acid called glycine today. Whereas ancestrally, I mean, we would consume glycine because it's richer in organ meats and also in bone broth. today we tend to consume primarily skeletal muscle, but when we consume collagenous tissue and bone broth, we're getting collagen. 1/3 of collagen is glycine, and glycine is rate limiting in the production of glutathione, which is our body's master antioxidant. So I know I'm tying together, a lot of sort of trending topics right now, like collagen and whatever. But I mean, there is merit, I think, to including these in the diet.
Yeah. And I'll add, so I have a family member close to me who has Parkinson's disease. I will not ever sleep in my home without an air filter. That's something that we can't control the environment, right? We can vote and we can try to drive less and we can do all of this. But if you can try to control your home environment, especially research showing that when we sleep being such a crucial time, I think that's really important just for people who are like, wait a minute, what about this air pollution? My loved one lives on a highway. And I think about this probably once a week. She's probably listening right now. Once a week, I think about, I wish you didn't live there. I wish that you would move, but that's not realistic. So there's home air filters going on in the house to make sure that where you're spending most of your time, the air is being filtered. And so I think when people sometimes hear like, oh, air pollution, they think I can do nothing. We also know indoor air pollution is tremendously toxic in some people's homes because of Febreze and Glade plugins, and Yankee candle season is coming. I'm always like, when Yankee candle season comes, like run away from that. Or, even just if you walk by Bath and Body Works, like it's just not like we don't need these things in our house. And so there's a lot of modifiable things too when you talk about air pollution that the individual can control.
Yeah, I mean, we've inherited a world that is by and large toxic. I mean, we've inherited a food supply that's 73% ultra-processed foods. Depending on where you live, I mean, you're being exposed to pollutants. Depending on the water that you're drinking, you're being exposed to pollutants. So I don't think it's fear-mongering. I think it's raising awareness, and I think that you got to do the best that you can. And even if you do the best that you can, there's still a component of luck. There's still a component of genetics. I'm not saying that we have all the answers, but we have brilliant people who are passionate people who are, ushering in really actionable science. And I think, if you do happen to live near, a freeway or even a golf course, there was a study recently that came out that found that people who lived less than a mile from golf courses were, seemingly at higher risk for the development of Parkinson's disease, with the thinking that they spray way more chemicals on golf courses than they do in the food supply, and that that chemical runoff might make its way into well water, depending on where the breeze is carrying these chemicals. And so I do think that, for a very small investment to have air purifiers in your home, I think it's something that is well worth it. I mean, my brother lives in Las Vegas. I think he lives fairly close to a golf course. For a couple $100s, he got, I think it was literally a couple $100, not over $1,000. He got a reverse osmosis system for his entire house, which removes everything from the water pretty much. So I definitely think it's worth it depending on where you live. Look, if you have low vitamin D levels, test for that, take a vitamin D supplement. If you live near a freeway or a golf course, maybe, reverse osmosis purifier for your house, an air purifier. I think that, you can look at this cynically, but you can also look at it as, oh, this is really empowering information to help me and my loved ones, achieve better health, not just today, but in the long run. And at the end of the day, that's what we're here for, right?
So well said.
Yeah, like if you don't want empowering information, why are you even listening to
No, they're here for it.
Yeah, of course.
And they're here to also, the great thing about my audience is that they're always up to have their thoughts, their mindset, their bias challenged. And
love it.
I always really appreciate that. Like I definitely have times where people are like, I thought I was going to hate this. And then I had one where I had Dr. Stacey Whitten on, dentist, talking about fluoride issues. And a scientist actually wrote me in, and she's like, when I saw this, I was like, I hate this. This is wrong. There's no way any of this is right. She's like, I listened to the whole show. I went in, I read through all the research papers, and I've completely changed my mind. And I'm like, That's amazing. So I appreciate you taking the time to change some minds with me today.
Of course. No, it's a pleasure. And, for me, people arrive at their professions and what they do and their advocacy. There are many reasons why one might engage with this topic. But for me, it comes from real trauma and real pain and having the person who meant the most to me in life ripped away from me because of chronic disease. And I'll never know what caused it for my mom. But, it mobilized me in a really profound way because I saw how sick she was. And it's my hope that if, one person at the very least can take something that I've got to offer away and use that to improve their lives and lower their risk to some degree for what it is that we had in my family, then it's worth it. So yeah, I'm just trying to do the best that I can.
Well, I appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining the conversation. If you could like, subscribe, or leave a review, it helps me so much in getting this information out to everyone who needs it. If you enjoyed this conversation, then I definitely want you to check out this.